After Pearl Harbor, the Pacific sky stopped being sky in the normal sense. It became an upright ocean, an empty, indifferent space where a single bad second could erase you. For fighter pilots in early 1942, air combat wasn't a romantic duel. It was a chain of short, sharp, brutal moments. A flash of metal dropping out of the sun, a half-beat of hesitation, and the sound of aluminum getting torn open. In ready rooms across the fleet, one name started to carry a particular kind of weight. Zero. Not because the Mitsubishi A6M was magic. Not because it was invincible. But because it forced American pilots into a game they felt built to lose. The Zero climbed faster, turned tighter, and, worst of all, could sit on your tail in a way the F4F Wildcat struggled to shake if you fought as a lone airplane. The Wildcat wasn't a bad fighter. It was rugged. It could take hits, sometimes limp back with holes that would have ripped other aircraft apart. But rugged only matters if you live long enough to use it. And in the one-on-one turning fights early in the war, too many American pilots died for the same very human reason. They saw the enemy and did what every instinct screamed: turn in and fight. Then the Zero slid inside their turn like a blade sliding under armor. By February 1942, the losses were stacking up into a pattern that felt almost mechanical. The numbers in combat reports weren't abstract to the men reading them. Each lost meant a face, a voice, a bunk in the squadron area that wouldn't be used again. The worst part wasn't simply death. It was death that repeated, same mistake, same setup, same result. In war, the cleanest deaths are the ones that have meaning. The ones that grind you down are the ones that feel preventable, because they happen the same way again and again. John Thach was one of the officers staring at those reports. He wasn't naive. He didn't think courage could make a heavier airplane suddenly outturn a lighter one. He understood the ugly truth. If you kept playing the Zero's game, the Zero would keep winning. And yet he was also a commander. He could not simply tell his pilots to run without feeling what that meant. Run might make sense on paper. In the air, it often meant leaving somebody behind. It meant watching a wildcat get trapped and knowing that if you broke away, you'd be alive. But your wingman might not be. Thach's problem was simple and brutal. He couldn't make the wildcat turn like a Zero. So he had to make one thing true. A Zero could not chase a wildcat safely anymore. A few days before one of his early combat encounters, Thach sat in his quarters at Naval Air Station San Diego with a small piece of civilian life on his desk. A pack of wooden matches his wife had mailed in a care package. 20 thin sticks in a paper box. Normal, ordinary, almost insulting in its simplicity compared to what he was carrying in his head. He picked up 2 matches and held them parallel. 2 aircraft, 2 pilots. Then he slid them in opposite directions, crossing them, then crossing again, never separating, always covering each other as they moved. The motion was simple, almost childish, but it hit him like a click in the machinery of his brain. What if wildcats didn't fight independently? What if they fought as a pair, weaving back and forth? If a Zero latched onto one wildcat's tail, that wildcat wouldn't try to win a turning contest it was built to lose. It would turn toward its wingman. The wingman would turn toward him. Their paths would cross, and the Zero, committed to the chase, would suddenly find itself flying toward a second airplane with guns pointed straight at it. It sounded insane. It violated the fighter doctrine most pilots had grown up with. Ever since World War I, the mental model was combat starts, formation breaks. Each pilot fights his own fight. Pairs might stay together for navigation, but once the shooting started, it was one-on-one. Thach looked at the matches and couldn't unsee it. Because the alternative was worse. Keep doing what the book said and keep watching good men die. A short time later, in the middle of an actual engagement, Thach saw a group of Zeros coming down with altitude advantage. You can feel that moment in your stomach even if you've never flown a fighter. The enemy above you isn't just higher. They're holding time, they're holding options. They can choose when and how the fight begins, and you're reacting. Standard doctrine said, split up, turn independently, fight alone. Thach didn't. Over the radio, he gave a simple order that sounded wrong on purpose. Stay paired, weave. His wingman was off to the right. 2 more Wildcats were behind and offset, a loose line that could easily break into 4 individual fights if panic took over. But Thach told his wingman to turn toward him, and he turned toward his wingman. From the outside, it looked like a collision waiting to happen. 2 fighters racing directly at each other in the middle of a dogfight. It was the kind of thing that makes pilots flinch, because every part of your training says, don't do this, not now, not at these speeds. But they weren't flying at a point of impact. They were flying at a point of crossing. At the crossing point, both pilots banked hard, passing with a separation that felt too close and yet was planned. Then they rolled and turned again, coming back around to cross once more. They weren't making circles. They were drawing a figure 8 through the air, a moving trap. 1-0 selected a Wildcat and committed to the tail chase. That was the Japanese pilot's comfort zone. Get behind, close distance, use superior maneuverability to line up the shot. In the old game, that Wildcat would try to outturn the Zero and die. But this Wildcat didn't turn away. He turned toward Thach. And now, the Zero pilot faced a choice he didn't like. Keep chasing and fly into the other Wildcat's guns, or break off and lose the shot. Thach's airplane came through the weave from the opposite direction, guns already aligned. The Zero pilot, suddenly staring down a face-to-face threat, pulled away. The attack unraveled. Other Zeros scattered, looking for cleaner angles. And the other pair of Wildcats, watching this happen in real time, started weaving too. The entire fight lasted only minutes, but it did something that mattered more than any single kill. It proved, in living daylight, that the Zero couldn't just sit on a Wildcat's tail and finish the job without paying a price. When the engagement ended, the Wildcats were still airborne. No one had fallen flaming into the ocean. No one had vanished into the empty blue. When Thach landed back aboard, his hands shook, not from fear in the moment, but from the adrenaline release afterward. The realization was almost disorienting. Maybe American pilots didn't have to die every time they met Zeros. He wrote the report. He described the concept. He recommended adoption. And the response, like so many responses in wartime bureaucracies, was cautious, slow, and bloodless. Interesting. Requires further testing. Not yet approved for widespread use. Thach stared at that kind of language like it was a foreign language. Because in the air requires further testing translated to one thing: more funerals. So he didn't wait. From February into the spring of 1942, he trained his squadron on the Weave relentlessly. Morning flights, afternoon flights, formation work until the timing felt automatic. The Weave was simple in theory. Turn toward your wingman, cross, turn back, cross again, but brutal in practice at combat speed with real enemy aircraft trying to kill you. Because the Weave lives and dies on timing. Cross too early, and the Zero hasn't committed enough. He still has space and time to adjust. The trap never really closes. Cross too late, and the Zero is already close enough to fire before your wingman's guns can matter. The trap closes after the victim is gone. Space too far apart, and the crossing doesn't create a true firing lane. The Zero can chase without entering the danger zone. Space too close, and you risk the one thing that ends everything instantly. Collision, hesitation, panic, because suddenly your wingman is not a partner. He's a hazard. And the most dangerous failure mode of all wasn't technical. It was psychological. Chasing the bait. Zeros were excellent at feints. One would appear vulnerable for a heartbeat, inviting the Wildcat to break formation and take the shot. If a pilot took that invitation, the pair fractured. And once the pair fractured, the fight snapped back into the Zero's favorite shape. One airplane, one target, one kill. Thach hammered the same ugly truth into pilots who wanted to be heroes. No victory is worth breaking your pair. Because at this stage of the war, the Navy didn't need lone aces as much as it needed fighters that could stay alive long enough to protect carriers, protect bombers, protect each other, and bring experience home. Then Midway arrived like a scheduled storm. On June 4, 1942, the air above the carriers turned into a crowded, violent geometry problem, vectors and angles and split-second choices. Different waves brought different numbers, but the sensation never changed. The sky filled with black specks that became airplanes, that became gun flashes. In one engagement, Thach's section found itself outnumbered. He called the Weave. Wildcats turned in, crossed, turned back. A Zero committed and suddenly had to decide whether the chase was still worth it. Another refused to break off. Confident, aggressive, until it met the point of the trap, converging 50 caliber fire in the crossing lane. But the Japanese pilots adapted quickly. They began using vertical separation, one Zero high, one low, attacking from different planes to force the Wildcat pair to split attention. This was where the Weave proved it wasn't just a trick. It was a philosophy. Structure first, target second. When the fight got messy, Thach's call wasn't, "Get him." It was, "Hold your wingman." There were moments when wingmen took hits, coolant streaming, smoke trailing like a white ribbon of bad news. In war, that sight triggers something primal. If you leave him, he dies. So Thach did what the Weave taught at its most basic level. He moved to cover, even if it meant abandoning a shot at another enemy. The principle wasn't score. The principle was, do not let the Zero isolate anyone. At one point, Thach found himself separated, alone without a wingman. Without a wingman, the Weave as a paired maneuver was gone. Alone in a Wildcat against Zeros was as close to a nightmare as a pilot could experience while still awake. But Thach had spent months thinking in geometry, and he understood something deeper. The Weave doesn't require two airplanes. It requires the enemy to be forced into continuous reaction. So he began making sharp, unpredictable reversals. Right, then instantly left, angular changes instead of smooth turns. Every time he reversed, the pursuing Zero had to correct. Every correction burned energy and reduced stability. Maneuverability matters only if it creates a stable firing solution, and Thach was determined to deny stability. The Zeros broke off, not because they couldn't turn, but because the chase had become a gamble, and good pilots don't gamble when the odds turn ugly. Thach came back alive, and in the ready rooms that night, pilots didn't talk about it like a clever tactic. They talked about it like a door that had finally opened. After Midway, the Weave spread the way life-saving knowledge spreads in war, faster than paperwork, faster than doctrine, faster than official approval. Pilots taught other pilots, quick diagrams, hand gestures. Turn into your wingman. Cross here. Don't chase the bait. Pair flights practiced around the carrier task force until the motion became instinct. The Japanese also adapted, and that adaptation was proof that the Weave had struck a nerve. Intercepts and pilot reports began to include warnings. Don't commit deep tail chases, attack in coordinated groups, approach from multiple angles. Which led to the next test, multi-direction attacks designed to break the Weave. In one such fight, Zeros approached high, left and right, 3 threats converging. This is the moment where new pilots often fail. Each pilot turns toward the closest danger, and the pair dissolves into chaos. Chaos is where the Zero thrives. But the radio call that saved the structure was the simplest, harshest thing it could be. Reform pairs, lock in, Weave standard, ignore the bait. It sounded cruel because ignore the bait means something is coming and you're not turning to meet it immediately. But if you break structure, you die fast. If you keep structure, you buy time, seconds that become options. And when the pairs locked back in, each pair created its own danger zone again. Each time a Zero committed, it had to break off or fly into converging fire. The fight stayed violent and confusing, but the foundation held. That was the real breakthrough. Not that the weave worked when everything was clean and simple, but that it could still hold when the enemy tried to smash it from multiple directions, so long as discipline didn't collapse. Guadalcanal made everything worse and clearer at the same time. The skies there were crowded, contested, and unforgiving. You often didn't have the luxury of long setups. You got airborne, and minutes later, you were in it. In that environment, the weave created a grim dividing line. Pilots who kept their pairs survived at higher rates. Pilots who fought alone, by instinct, by habit, by pride, died more often. Not because they lacked courage, because air combat doesn't reward courage if it's attached to the wrong method. In those turning fights, breaking formation and chasing individual kills handed the Zero exactly what it wanted. Isolation, after enough reports confirmed the pattern, training became urgent and mandatory. The weave stopped being Thach's idea and became common survival language. Units drilled it until pilots could do it without thinking, because in the actual fight, you do not have time to think. Even then, the Pacific never became safe. The weave didn't reduce the number of bullets in the sky. It only gave pilots a better chance not to die in the first 10 seconds of contact. There were still days you couldn't weave fast enough. A cloud bank hid your wingman for 2 seconds, an engine coughed at the wrong moment, a random burst punched a fuel tank. A diving attack came in too close. 2 seconds is enough to lose sight. Losing sight is enough to lose your wingman. Losing your wingman is enough to die. And some losses left nothing but a line in the report. Missing, because the ocean took the rest. That's why the weave mattered. Not because it promised glory, but because it promised something smaller and more real, time. And in the Pacific War, time, seconds, was the difference between a man stepping off the flight deck after landing and a name becoming a number. In later years, aircraft changed, engines grew more powerful, speeds doubled, then tripled. But the idea behind the weave survived because it wasn't tied to one airplane. It was tied to a truth. 2 fighters working as one are harder to kill than 2 fighters fighting as individuals. Different storytellers will argue the exact dates, the exact locations, the exact names in the supporting cast. War stories often blur at the edges, but the core doesn't blur. A commander watched men die under the old rules and refused to keep playing. He couldn't make his airplane faster or lighter, so he changed how his pilots flew together. He made tail chasing dangerous. He used the simplest object on a desk, 2 wooden matches, to imagine the most valuable thing a pilot can have in war, a way to bring his people home. After Guadalcanal, the strangest thing wasn't how many more fights the weave won. The strangest thing was how it changed the way people thought about survival. Before that, every fighter pilot was raised on a deeply personal dream. I'll be better, faster, sharper, and I'll win the duel. But the Pacific taught a brutal lesson. When the sky's crowded, when the enemy has numbers, when you're protecting carriers, bombers, airstrips. The lone hero is just another way to become an empty chair in the ready room. From late 1942 into 1943, American squadrons started gaining what they'd been missing: time to train, hard-earned survival experience, and, eventually, newer, stronger aircraft. But even as the machines changed, the feeling of air war stayed the same. One clean, timed tail chase can end you, and only formation discipline can pull you back from that ending. So the weave didn't die with the Wildcat. It carried over into other aircraft as a kind of shared reflex. People stopped thinking, that's an F4F trick. They started thinking, that's how 2 people save each other. And if you look closely, you'll see it spread the way war always spreads, without elegant paperwork and with words that smell like fuel and exhaust. Don't split the pair. Don't get greedy. If you're saddled, drag it toward your wingman. If your wingman's saddled, dive in and cover him. Those lines weren't written for books. They were written for mouths, so someone could shout them in the seconds before a Zero could settle its sights. The Japanese didn't stand still either. They tried everything to break the danger zone American pairs created, Attacks from multiple directions, high-low slashes, bait-and-switch feints, group tactics instead of solo chases. But the more they tried, the more they ran into an uncomfortable truth. The weave wasn't a rigid geometry drill. It was a fighting attitude. Once an American pilot absorbed the mindset of never alone, you could change your angle of attack, but you couldn't change the constant. You weren't allowed to kill fast by isolating a target anymore. In war, nothing irritates an opponent like someone who refuses to die the correct way. But war is still war. The weave didn't make the sky fair. There were days with low clouds, bad visibility, radios full of static, a pitching carrier deck, wind gusts. Days when the clean formation you practiced on paper turned into something you had to patch together second by second. Some days, a wingman got separated because a cloud bank slid through for exactly 2 seconds. 2 seconds was enough for a Zero to slip onto a tail. Some days, an engine coughed at the exact moment you pulled up to cover your buddy. Some days you landed with a bullet hole inches from the cockpit, and a deck crewman looked at you like you'd walked out of a saw blade. And some days you didn't land. Not every death came with a spectacular fireball. A lot of deaths in the air looked like a slight wobble, a thin ribbon of smoke, an aircraft dropping into the sea like a stone. The ocean swallowed it, and the silence returned so fast it felt wrong. There was no battlefield to take back a body, no time to stand and watch. Just a new gap on the roster and a hoarse voice in the ready room reading a name like a life that got cut clean in half. That's why the men who lived clung to anything that helped them live, even if it only bought a few more seconds. In the middle of all that, Thach became a particular kind of figure. Not the commander famous for the most kills, but the commander known for something rarer. He brought more people home. There's a kind of authority war creates. Not the authority of medals, but the authority of survival rumors. A brand new pilot might hear the old hand say, "Don't split the pair," and not believe it. But then he'd notice the men saying it were still alive. And he'd learn. When new fighters like the Hellcat and Corsair arrived and American air power began to swing the balance, something else stayed true. Even with better aircraft, they didn't throw away the old principle. Because they'd learned the real lesson. Better machines give you more options. Formation discipline keeps you from dying when you pick the wrong one. By the late war, many of Japan's best pilots were gone. Their skill was still dangerous, but war isn't just skill. It's a grinder. When experience gets worn down and replacements can't mature fast enough, a tactic like the weave becomes even more hated. It doesn't let you finish quick. It drags the fight out. It forces you to burn energy, burn patience, and sometimes burn the most precious thing a fighter pilot has: confidence in the tail chase. And on the American side, every pilot who made it back created another experienced pilot. Experienced pilots trained new pilots. New pilots lived longer. It became an accelerating chain. One the Zero couldn't break just by turning tighter. Thach probably understood that better than anyone. He didn't talk about it like a flashy revolution. He talked about it like something that had to be done, because if it wasn't, he'd keep watching names turn into numbers. Then the war ended. In August 1945, the shooting faded. But for the people who'd lived in cockpits, the war didn't shut off like a switch. It stayed in their reflexes, flinching at a loud engine, scanning the sky without thinking, remembering faces that vanished from formation like they'd been erased from the air. When peace came, a lot of men left the service. A lot of them didn't talk much about what they'd seen. Some stories can't be fully told to someone who's never heard metal tear open in the sky. Thach stayed in uniform for years, not because he loved war or chased power, but because he understood something simple. If a tactic can save lives, you pass it on before memory fades. In the decades that followed, the world saw new wars. Airspeeds changed, radar changed, missiles changed. But in fighter schools, in lessons about two-ship tactics, the old principle kept showing up under new names. two aircraft covering each other, turning toward each other, creating a danger zone for the guy trying to sit on your tail. You can change the label, change the syllabus, change the airplane, but the core stays painfully human. Don't let your wingman fight alone. And that may be Thach's strangest legacy. Not a trick to rack up kills, but a way to survive long enough to come back. Museums display the small artifacts of war, scraps of metal, maps, personal effects. And among them sometimes are things so ordinary, most people walk right past. Something as trivial as a pack of matches. But to fighter pilots, those small objects carry a different weight. They're a reminder that sometimes the line between living and dying isn't a miracle technology. It's a moment when a commander stares straight into desperation and decides to think differently. If you've made it this far, you understand why stories like this shouldn't disappear. They aren't just about tactics. They're about what people do when they're forced into a fight where they're outmatched and still try to bring each other home. If you want more World War II stories about small tactics that changed entire battles, hit like and subscribe to your channel. Because the more people watch, the more these stories get told instead of sinking into silence. And when you think about the Weave, remember the image that matters most. Not two airplanes crossing in sunlight, but two human beings trusting each other at a speed where being half a beat late can kill you. In an era where the sky could take you in seconds, they chose something against instinct, turning toward each other so they could survive together.